when India went to Mars, right, and made it to Mars in the first attempt, the media was only talking about how cheap the mission was, the price tag, which is a very classic case of a single narrative, a single story, a stereotyping of a hemisphere or a country. They didn't talk about all the other amazing things, right? They didn't talk about that beautiful photograph which went viral with women, wearing silk saris and flowers in their hair, celebrating the arrival of the spacecraft.
As someone who has a keen interest in space, I'm very excited to feature Dr. Susmita Mohanty, a serial space entrepreneur who started India's first private space startup, Earth to Orbit, at a time when the Indian space industry didn't welcome private players. She had also previously founded MoonFront and LIQUIFER, worked briefly with NASA and Boeing, and as a climate activist, visited both the Arctic and Antarctica on invitation. Dr. Mohanty has now started India's first space think tank, Spaceport SARABHAI. A protégée of author Clarke, she has been featured in numerous publications such as Fortune, Vogue, and Bloomberg. As ISRO is solidifying its global presence and more private players are coming up in India, Dr. Mohanty shares interesting insights and what we can look forward to. Hello, Dr. Susmita. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm really excited to finally have you. I know we've been going back and forth a bit because of certain constraints, but great to finally have you on it.
Thank you, Marty. I mean, I've been wanting to talk to you. It's just that with COVID and stuff, there have been so many disruptions.
Yeah. So, if I had to start listing out all the titles and achievements that you've earned, I'm sure I'll take up half your time. So I'm going to save that for the introduction I'm going to do prior to this conversation. But I do want to ask you, was there a definitive point in your childhood while growing up, looking back, that, spurred your space endeavors?
So I think my formative years, I would call them the 70s and the 80s. I was in Ahmedabad because my dad worked for one of the big ISRO centers that's in Ahmedabad. And I wouldn't say there was one particular moment or one particular day, but I would say that being surrounded by space scientists and also amazing contemporary architects who were being commissioned by the cotton mill owner families of Ahmedabad to build private residences and public buildings, I was quite naturally inspired by this crossover space of architecture, design, and the sciences. So you could say that there was this cumulative aura around me of the cultural milieu and the scientific milieu, and that's what really groomed me growing up.
That's actually a wonderful environment to grow up in. And you've been writing letters to, space agencies and personalities since high school. And among the people you wrote were Bill Gates and Carl Sagan. And it was while writing to them that author Clarke actually replied to your letters. So I'm really intrigued. What did you discuss? What was the design or idea that you put forth to Clarke that, convinced him to pick up the phone and call you and fund your further education?
Well, I grew up like many others in the pre-internet age when libraries were the big thing.
Right.
And I was very lucky to be in Ahmedabad, where in a very small radius of maybe 5 kilometers or 8 kilometers, I could bicycle to every single cool library, whether it's Indian Institute of Management, School of Architecture, the Physical Research Laboratory, Space Application Center, National Institute of Design. In fact, I've lived around the world. I've lived in 4 different countries, but I've never come across a geography which is so dense with these centers of excellence. So what I'm trying to say here is these libraries became my conduit to the wider world. And if I wanted to send an idea to someone or write to someone, I could, kind of come up with an address which was somewhat imaginary, but true. If I were to write to Bill Gates, I would just say, CEO, Microsoft, Seattle, Washington, USA. And back in the day, snail mail would deliver. The letters would actually get to the person.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's amazing because I would actually work on imaginary problems of living and working in microgravity when I was in high school. It was not part of my curriculum or anything. I had inherited my dad's German portable typewriter, so I would type up my projects. There was no computer then, right? So I would type up my projects on the typewriter. I would go to these libraries, I would draw by hand, and I would solve design problems. So I would send them, and for every 10 letters that I would write to NASA or a university or the European Space Agency, I would hear back from 3 of them or 2 of them. And that was an amazing catalyst of sorts for a young person to keep going. So in 96, when I was looking for $35,000 to be able to go to the International Space University in Strasbourg in France, I must have written to 70 foundations, 70.
Wow.
I wrote to the United Nations. I approached the United Nations in 9 different ways. And I also wrote to 7 different individuals, including, as you said, Carl Sagan, Bill Gates, Arthur Clarke, and a couple of others. So in response, so what I had sent them, Mohanty, was a synopsis of all of the projects that I had done on my own, like abstracts of different projects.
Okay.
And there was a cover letter, which was written by hand. And there was a nice big fat document, which was called the saucer concept. So in that project, I had argued that a saucer is a better way, architecturally speaking, psychologically speaking, for long duration human missions than this Coke can, sort of concocted arrangement that you see for the International Space Station.
Okay.
So that's the big fat project I had sent along with a synopsis of all others to these individuals. And I got a call from Arthur Clarke himself. It was a weekend afternoon and I was napping. So he called me from Colombo and said, "Thanks for your enclosure, Susmita. Let me know how much you would want me to transfer to the Space University on your behalf." And I was completely zapped, and I kind of blurted out a number, which I then sent him a fax and said I just said something. So he basically gave me a blank check. He wrote to the university saying, "Let me know, and I will have it transferred, whatever her tuition is." So despite the blank check, I sort of kept a loan and let him take care of a significant chunk, and that's that. And since then, he sort of became a mentor, but also a friend. We used to communicate right up until he passed away in 2009.
You, in fact, even held a celebration gala for him in 2001 to honor his work.
Yeah, that was quite fantastic, actually. It was not just me, it was a bunch of us in California, including the Space Frontier Foundation. So my company then was called MoonFront. I had a small boutique consulting firm in San Francisco and a few others. Together, we had a big party in the Playboy Mansion grounds in Los Angeles, where, we beamed Arthur Clarke as a 3D hologram live from Colombo. And we celebrated the year 2001, the new millennium, Kubrick, the film. There were all these guys who showed up: Morgan Freeman, Tom Hanks, Cameron, Captain Picard was also there. So, I mean, it was a good, fun party.
It sounds like a great party.
Oh, yeah. I mean, so you see, I mean, I've done fun things. I don't have to, people often get stuck with a job. I've done all kinds of things for the love of space and exploration.
May I ask why Playboy Mansion?
Well, I think that was the idea that the Space Frontier Foundation, which happens to be based out of Los Angeles, decided to come. And if you've read any of the Playboy magazines, which I have, Arthur Clarke, these science fiction writers back in the day would write essays and articles and stories for them. So there have been Arthur Clarke's pieces which were published in the Playboy magazine. And back in the day, the Playboy magazine was pretty cool. Now it's just, it looks like a cheap glossy. So if you can get your hands on some of the vintage magazines, you will know what I mean. And it was a good connect,
Okay. Unfortunately, I haven't read Playboy. I've only seen the magazine, but maybe when I'm in US, I should try to.
I think they were, editorially speaking, they were done in a very, very tasteful manner. And many of these great writers have even written for the magazine, including Clarke.
Okay, interesting. With reference to what you spoke about while growing up, you had like the influence of, because of your father, the whole space community and the architecture. You have always espoused that science and art need to work in tandem. Do you find that happening, especially with the space industry, or you think a lot more needs to be done?
Well, certainly not enough is happening in trying and getting the art world to participate in exploratory missions as much as the world of science. I find it very unfortunate that the world has created this giant silo called STEM. I never grew up with this idea of STEM, and I find it quite restricting because for me, art, architecture, design, technology, and eventually business is sort of a seamless world that I inhabit. So putting people into STEM silos is a very bad idea, if you ask me. And if you look at, let's take the International Space Station, for example, which is orbiting the Earth every 90 minutes as we speak. So have art experiments been flown on the International Space Station? Yes, a few, very few compared to the number of science experiments that are flown. Have artists from around the world want to be engaged with exploration? Yes, absolutely. There's always, there's not only interest, there are these collectives, of artists who are interested in art related to exploration and space.
Right.
There has also been a proposal by one of the artists that there should have been an art module, a dedicated art module on the space station, for example, right? So there is interest, but there isn't been enough traction within the government agencies to allow for artists to participate in a big way. And I'm hoping that will change in the coming decade because, the artists have been really campaigning for almost 20 years now, if you ask me. Similar to, let's say, the space architects who campaigned for almost 15 years to make space architecture recognized professional discipline within the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, because there was always pushback from the engineers. In summary, what I'd say is there isn't enough of art, industrial design, architecture, as there should be in space missions. There should be more of it. There aren't even job openings in space agencies for architects, for artists, for industrial designers. It's only engineers, right?
Yeah, that's true.
That needs to change. I'm all for changing that.
Okay. When I, saw one of your interviews, you had mentioned how, the Japanese Space Agency, in fact, consulted with fishermen on how they can collect the space debris using a very specialized net. So that was actually really fascinating to hear.
Yeah. So, Japan, so in the Eastern Hemisphere, Japan, China, and India are doing amazing things in space. And Japan, for one, what fascinates me about the Japanese Space Agency is they take on very unusual missions, Mohanty. So the one you mentioned, yes, they very much did collaborate with a well-known fisherman to design a kind of net, which would be on a tether, on a satellite, which would go out and scoop up debris in low Earth orbit.
Okay.
And the mission went awry because the tether didn't deploy properly, but had it deployed as they wanted to, it could have, been a great experiment. The other mission that the Japanese did, which I absolutely love, is this was the second mission that they did, Hayabusa 2. There was a precursor, Hayabusa 1, which had also been successful. So Hayabusa 2 visited a faraway asteroid and brought back asteroid dust and rocks back to Earth. The Americans always talk about asteroid mining and there's a lot of hype around it, but they haven't done it yet. The Japanese have actually visited an asteroid and brought back samples.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I absolutely love the Japanese.
I want to talk about your India's first space startup, Earth to Orbit, which you started in 2009, at a time when, private space players weren't welcomed as yet. How daunting was it, especially when you had to consider, working, you wanted to bring US to work with the PSLV launch, and at a time when there was an embargo on such deals?
Okay, let's clarify here. So the idea was to have American satellites launch on the Indian PSLV rocket.
Right.
That was one of the long-term efforts that I undertook. So coming back to your first half of your question, I don't think it was daunting for me personally because it was my third venture. And I usually take the plunge without worrying too much about anything. I mean, nothing has really been daunting for me in my entire life. If you ask me, I've been pretty fearless about what I want to do, and I just go out and do it. But the reality is that in India, there is very little support financially and also in terms of government contracts for new space companies. The word startup is now used very commonly, but when I started my first venture in the year 2000, the word wasn't in vogue really. So I think India lacks the kind of ecosystem, funding ecosystem, and also the business ecosystem that we find in developed space economies like the United States, like France, even China. So India has an amazing government space program, one of the most accomplished government space programs in the world. I would easily put India in the top 5 or top 6 in terms of space capabilities.
Okay.
There are very few nations who have launched capability. We are one of them.
Yeah.
There are very few nations who are sending humans into space. We will very soon be one of them. However, the private industry really hasn't taken off yet because we don't have policies, which support the opening up, the liberalization of the space industry, as has been the case with IT and biotech. So I think space is there's been this huge delay. But now the government has expressed an interest in space reforms. Have they done everything that is necessary to back up their intent? I would say not yet. There is no policy framework yet to back up the reforms that the Prime Minister has announced.
Okay.
So I think we have a long way to go on that front.
Yeah. Now that the doors have been open for private players, and that's what I wanted to ask you, what is the ground reality?
So let's first acknowledge that for the last 50 years, ISRO was incorporated in 1972. ISRO came into legal existence in 1972. Before that, the people who were hired by Sarabhai to get the space program going, they were mostly working under the Atomic Energy Commission.
Yeah.
Right. So it started a little before that, early 70s, late 60s. And it's been 50 years. There have been, I'm told, anywhere between 400 to 500 companies, small, medium, large size legacy corporations that have been building components, subsystems, and system level stuff for ISRO, for our satellites and for our rockets.
Okay.
So it's not that the industry has not been contributing to ISRO's mandate and to ISRO's satellite making and rocket making and all that. They are, but they have been limited to only serving ISRO's needs, right? What we need now is for policy to allow these companies sort of a more liberal playing field so that they can not only serve ISRO's needs, but also go out and compete internationally. Today, the space market, the international space market, annually brings in revenues of almost $440 billion. And India is barely scratching the surface there. We hardly have any role in that big market. So I want us to get to that next phase where we become a force to reckon with in the international space marketplace. And that cannot happen until the government eases regulations. ISRO embraces a policy where they support space companies with an open heart and an open mind, which is slowly starting to happen because of the recent announcement by the Prime Minister, which is, I believe, a good thing.
Right.
But if you look at, I worked for the Americans, I worked with the Europeans, I worked with the Japanese in various capacities. The kind of regulatory environment they have, I would say India is 40 years behind the US, maybe 30 years behind France, maybe 20 years behind China. So we really need to catch up on the regulatory front. And also, the other big thing is funding. In the US, a company like SpaceX or a company like Blue Origin, they make their billions off of government contracts, NASA contracts and DoD contracts. In India, we barely have government contracts, very small ones that go out to private companies.
Okay.
So that's number two. We need large government contracts to go to these private players in order to make them competitive, right? Third, we need the kind of private funding that is now available in Silicon Valley, in Israel, in France, in Europe, largely speaking, in China. We don't have that kind of funds for our new entrepreneurs, what we call new space entrepreneurs. They have been able to raise about 5 million to 11 million in their pre-Series A. But for the Series A, B, and C, in order for them to be internationally competitive, I think they need to be raising money in the order of what Silicon Valley companies are raising. So I think we have a long way to go, but I think we are headed in the right direction.
So ISRO basically needs to move from being a gatekeeper to more of a collaborator.
I think that's well put, yes. And they should not feel intimidated, or they should not feel that we are competitors. They should look at young space entrepreneurs as allies.
Right.
That mindset change has to happen. They need to be able to pat their back and say, fantastic. For example, let's look at Team Indus. Maybe you've heard of Team Indus. It was one of the 3 teams that made it to the top of the Google Lunar X Prize. So the Google Lunar X Prize was a $30 million prize purse for any private team that could build a moon rover and launch it to the moon, land it successfully, and have it rove on the lunar surface for 500 meters and send back images. So that was the contest. Nobody actually made it, but there were these milestone prizes as a run-up to the actual final prize. And Team Indus from India was in the top 3. And you never heard, I never heard anyone high-ranking within ISRO openly applauding the Team Indus team.
Right.
So there was always this sort of an introverted mindset where they wouldn't come out and praise these young people trying to do an amazing thing internationally. So I think those are the things that need to change. And not only should we embrace these young people who are doing cutting edge stuff, but also give them funds and give them regulatory support.
In terms of funding, what is your feel about, say, the VC industry showing interest in the space community in terms of they will have the mindset to do it for the long run?
So space, unlike IT, is an industry where the gestation periods are very long.
Yeah.
It takes a good 6-7 years to build stuff, make them flight ready, and launch them, right? This is not, you're not sitting on a desktop writing code. You're actually building flight hardware, and you sometimes fail. The launch can go awry, the satellite can fail. So what we need is patient long-term capital. And I'm happy to say that finally, Indian investors are warming up to the idea of investing in space companies. So there have been a dozen or more Indian VC firms that have put what I would call seed funding into some really amazing startups. One of them is building green propulsion. One of them is planning to set up a constellation of hyperspectral satellites. Another company is one of the best when it comes to single wall carbon nanotubes. So these are cutting edge technologies that are being built right here in India, in Bangalore, in Hyderabad, in Chennai, so to speak. So yes, we have had some traction. And like I said earlier, these companies have managed to raise anywhere between 3 million to 11 million in their pre-Series A funding, which is a good start. But I think the very same investors will have to have a greater appetite and also come in for Series A. And let's hope we can also get investors from abroad to invest in Series B and Series C, for example. So my space think tank is also going to be working on that front. We will try and facilitate ways to bring in more interest for Indian companies from private investors abroad. That's on our agenda.
That's fascinating. That was actually my next question. Last year, you started India's first space think tank, Spaceport SARABHAI. So you mentioned this is one of your aims of the think tank, but also to that you want to change the narrative, in the space industry, that it has to move away from US based and NASA based, accomplishments, and more of the European and the Eastern hemisphere. So could you talk about what is your main goals through the think tank?
Absolutely. I'll be happy to. So I did move away from mainstream entrepreneurship after almost 20 plus years and decided that it's time to engage in a significant way from a space law and policy angle, because those will be the enablers if we are to have a thriving space economy. So the 4 or 5 major goals of the think tank, I would describe them as, the first one is we want to give India an international voice in all matters of consequence. There are countries now unilaterally legislating when it comes to space, access to space resources, ownership of space resources. There are serious issues around space debris and space debris mitigation, space traffic management. So we want India to be playing a leadership role when it comes to crafting these laws internationally. We usually are a very silent participant. We need to be more active internationally. Second, we want to do everything we can to make India a developed space economy by 2030. Third, we want to grow the body of knowledge that should inform policy making. Currently the policy documents that ISRO has put out, in my view, are eminently rewritable because they need to be talking to law and policy experts. Scientists can't be writing policy documents. So we really need, and the most important thing is to have the right kind of data to back up the policy framework. For example, we don't have any reliable data on how big the Indian space industry is today. So one of the projects we are undertaking as one of our initial projects is how do we go about sizing the Indian space industry? It's never been done, right? There is a flimsy report that was put out by PwC where they have pulled numbers out of thin air, if you ask me. But we need to do in-depth research, collect primary data, come up with real numbers, and look at very many aspects of how the industry functions. For example, a study we are currently conducting with IIM Kozhikode with one of their PhD candidates is we're looking at why Indian co-founders usually incorporate their companies abroad.
Right.
And even if they incorporate in India, they always incorporate abroad as a second leg, so to speak. So we are looking into that in depth, for example. So we need to do these kind of management research to influence policymaking. Policymaking can't simply happen within ISRO, with a bunch of scientists sitting around and discussing how they want to write it. So that's the third goal, growing the body of knowledge. The fourth one is how do we build public perspective? And that's where I think space narrative comes in. If you ask anybody in India, young or old, many of them have heard of NASA and what NASA is doing, and not enough people know about what ISRO is doing. I mean, they know that we have a space agency, but not enough is known to them.
Yeah.
So we want to invite opinion pieces. We want to invite articles. We also want to work on the history side of things. The ISRO, for example, has amazing archives, and they don't share it with the wider public, as is the case with NASA or the European Space Agency. So, for example, not many people know that India has already tested a crew capsule, an unmanned crew capsule, twice already. Not many people know that ISRO has tested a scaled model of the space shuttle. So the thing is, I think ISRO needs to do much better with their PR or public relations and sharing of information and archives with the public. And we want to help on that front for people in India and also people abroad to get to know more about what's happening in the Eastern Hemisphere, what's happening with the Chinese space program, what's happening with the Indian space program or the Japanese space program. Because for the longest time, if you see, the narrative has been shaped by Hollywood films and by NASA, which spends enormous amounts of money on public relations and sharing media with the public and so on. So we need to recenter the narrative and have the people sort of wrap their heads around what's happening here on the Eastern Hemisphere as well. And even in Europe, amazing things are happening, but everybody only talks about NASA. I can give you an example from the Eastern Hemisphere. I mean, when India went to Mars, right, and made it to Mars in the first attempt, the media was only talking about how cheap the mission was, the price tag, which is a very classic case of a single narrative, a single story, a stereotyping of a hemisphere or a country. They didn't talk about all the other amazing things, right? They didn't talk about that beautiful photograph which went viral with women, wearing silk saris and flowers in their hair, celebrating the arrival of the spacecraft in Martian orbit. They didn't talk about the fact that here was a space agency that could pull off a planetary mission in just 14 months, like just a year and 2 months, whereas typically a space agency takes about 6 to 7 years after the budget is approved for a planetary mission. So that is also a kind of innovation, organizational innovation. How do you get the team together and accomplish in 1/6 the time or 1/5 the time? How do you compress time cycles? So what I'm trying to say is media often stereotypes, and therefore the narrative is always stuck in one place. People always look at India as an outsourcing hub, as a place for frugal engineering, as a place where things are made cheap, but that's not true.
Yeah.
We also do cutting edge stuff. I mentioned a few of them earlier in this program.
Yeah.
So I think we need to overhaul those stereotypes. Or if you look at Hollywood films, typically they would stereotype the Chinese as two floating chopsticks, or the Russians as the bad guys, right?
Yeah.
But that's not the case. The Chinese are doing amazing stuff. I mean, they are the only country to have been on the moon 3 times consecutively, successfully in the last 10 years. America last went to the moon in 1972. The Russians last went to the moon in 1976.
That's an amazing feat.
Yeah, so I think narratives are very important. And we need to not only rebuild, recenter, but also sort of control the narrative, if that's the word, because it's being controlled for too long by Western media and Hollywood, and it needs to change.
I completely agree, because my son, who is fascinated by, rockets and space and, spaceships, anytime we talk about it, he immediately goes and, talks about America and NASA and what they're doing. And then I have to tell him, ISRO is doing so many interesting things. And I talk about the Mars mission. And another interesting fact is that they did it on their first attempt.
That's right. I don't blame kids, actually, because, NASA puts out such amazing material online that it is but natural for any young, curious person to go find amazing NASA missions and photographs and be inspired by them.
Yeah.
And I think ISRO needs to learn from NASA in terms of how to, communicate with the public and how to be more generous in what they share with the public.
True. And how to market themselves.
Absolutely. Well. Absolutely.
And, talking about ISRO, they're also working right now on Gaganyaan, a very ambitious human spaceflight project. In fact, in the latest union budget, they've earmarked rupees 13,700 crore for the space industry. Do you think that is sufficient for a project like this? Or I also wanted to, ask you, is there a perception in the Indian space community that ISRO might be, more focused on doing missions that generate publicity rather than explore space and engineering?
I think ISRO has done a fantastic job of becoming self-sufficient in building satellites for telecommunications, for remote sensing, for GPS. And they have built 2 amazing launch vehicles, right? We have the PSLV that launches Earth observation satellites, and we have the GSLV that can launch, I believe, up to 4 tons of ComSats, and they're building sort of the next generation GSLV, which can launch even heavier ComSats. So I think ISRO has done phenomenally well, exceptionally well, in becoming technology independent. There are only 7 countries in the world that can launch things into space, and we are one of them. So we've already done the homework. We've become technology independent, more or less. So now, what is the natural next step for any agency? It's planetary exploration.
Right.
So that includes planetary science. Let's explore Venus. Let's explore the sun. Let's explore Mars. And there's the human exploration component, right? So let's launch humans. The first step is low Earth orbit. When I say low Earth orbit, it is about 350 to 400 kilometers from the Earth. That's where our astronauts will orbit when they will fly on the first Gaganyaan mission, right? And India will become the 4th country to have attempted to send humans into low Earth orbit. China did this 15 years ago. So they are very, very experienced already in human spaceflight.
Okay.
The Russians, Yuri Gagarin flew in 1961, right? Then the Americans came, and then the Chinese started their human space program in the early part of this millennium. And now India is getting into the human exploration thing. So I think India is doing things in a very systematic, very pragmatic way where there are no disruptions. There's continuity, there's pragmatism, and the budget keeps increasing every year to accommodate the roadmap that's evolving. So I think India overall, in terms of planning, budgetary allocation, and continuity of mission and direction, we have done extremely well. We have no money to waste, right? For example, in the United States, every 4 years, when a new president is elected, the head of NASA changes. And often the heads of different centers which are under NASA also change. So sometimes what happens is if Bush wanted to go to the moon, and then Obama wants to go to Mars, and then Trump wants to go to the moon. So there's always this compass change, right?
All right.
And change of leadership. And that sometimes results in very, very mature programs being shelved, even after millions have been spent and they're quite flight ready. They sometimes get scrapped. So they waste millions of dollars as well. For a country like India, there is no wastage, right? We can't change direction. We won't say today we are going to moon and tomorrow we are going to Mars, so let's cancel that program.
Right.
We are going to moon and we are going to Mars and we are going to Venus. So we are not choosing with different political leaders or heads that which way should our compass point to. So I think we have been very pragmatic and not wasteful at all. And I think ISRO is doing the right thing, the way it's approaching all of this in a very, very fluid, organic manner. The trajectory has been very, very good, if you ask me. I just wish that ISRO would share a roadmap with the public, which they don't. Because if you go online, you can find NASA's roadmap, you can find European Space Agency's roadmap, but you can't find ISRO's roadmap. I want to know what the space agency is thinking. Where are we going 20 years from now?
Yeah.
Where's the roadmap? So I think we need that. We need ISRO to share with us. We don't want to know, okay, tomorrow we are flying to Mars. We want to know where are you going 50 years from now as well. We need a long-term vision for the country, and it should be public information.
Do you think ISRO plans that far ahead, or is it looking at the next decade?
I think every space agency does look at a 10, 20-year horizon, if not 50. So 50 might be stretching it a bit, but I think if India wants to be a serious contender in the international space market, we have to have a 50-year, a 100-year horizon. The reason I say that is now we have something called the low Earth orbit economy, which is starting to emerge. What I mean by that is in low Earth orbit, we will be doing servicing, we'll be doing repairs, we'll be doing cleanup of debris. So there is a lot of business that's going to happen in low Earth orbit. And India will completely miss the boat if we are not even thinking about those matters.
Right.
We will end up playing catch up. So I think it's important for us as a nation to think not 10, not 20, but 50 years ahead, 10 years ahead, and be part of the economy as well, the space economy, not just accomplish missions. It's very important.
Right. On that note, you had mentioned during your TEDx talk One of the things that caught my attention was how you said the last century was for aviation exploration. This century is going to be for space exploration.
Yeah, I do believe that. Yes, I think what happened with commercial aviation in the last century is flying, which was a very expensive affair in the 60s, became fairly routine by the time we were in the 90s. Everybody started flying, right? It became affordable. There were lots of airlines to choose from. So that's the shift that happened from the 60s to the 90s. Similarly, I think if you look at this century, starting now in the coming decade or two, I would say that access to space will become a lot more democratized. Whether it's good or not for the environment, that's something we all need to think about, because casual space tourism will further pollute near Earth space, which is already polluted. We have already something around 330 million man-made debris objects orbiting near Earth space. And each of these debris objects, whether it's a dead satellite or a chunk of a rocket stage, they're all moving at enormous speeds. What I mean by that is they're moving at almost 28,000 kilometers an hour, and they're like ticking time bombs. So I do think the technology has gotten to a point where people don't have to be super highly trained to be heading to space. If they can pull extreme G's on a roller coaster, they can fly into space. It'll slowly get more affordable, but I think we need to think carefully about casual space tourism, because it's going to be damaging the environment. So we really need to think about things from a holistic perspective.
When I listened to Space Cafe podcast that you had done, and you'd mentioned about how Musk's SpaceX, a part of the rocket that he had launched earlier, is going to be crash landing on Moon. And I looked it up and I read about it. And apparently that little piece of the rocket is the size of a school bus. Like you mentioned earlier, if countries like India or China had done something like that, they would definitely face some kind of action maybe. So in that regard, do you sometimes worry with companies like SpaceX and Virgin Galactic and Jeff Bezos, Blue Origin? Will it go from space exploration to space exploitation?
Yeah, I think we Homo sapiens, we humans are such that the line that separates exploration and exploitation is very, very thin, very blurred. Even if you look at polar exploration, I went to Antarctica in 2017, and one of our landings, we were on an island called Deception Island. It's a volcanic island.
Okay.
And on this island, we saw these massive rusted silos. Imagine these big cylindrical silos, rusted and sitting on this island for many, many years. And guess what they were? They were silos where these explorers, British explorers, Norwegian explorers, whoever had been to that island, they had wiped out the entire seal population. And those silos were for storing blubber for oil. Right?
Oh,
so this is just sort of an example of polar expeditions, what they did. And I think a very similar trajectory is starting to emerge when it comes to outer space. There are countries like the United States and Luxembourg, which have already passed laws in their parliament. In the case of the US, it's the US Congress, which say that if an American company goes and brings back stuff from asteroids or any other celestial body, they can own it. So this kind of unilateral legislation is already kind of hinting at a wild, wild west. Whoever gets it, keeps it. So I think that danger is eminently present, and people like me and others are aware of it. So I do think we need international laws which are enforceable. The two big worrying factors for us in the space industry are mega constellations. There are companies launching thousands of satellites. If you look at Elon Musk's Starlink constellation, I believe he's planning to launch 42,000 satellites.
Wow.
So if you allow a single entity, a single private entity to launch that many satellites, it is the equivalent, in my view, of a 3D real estate grab in space. Space is a shared resource.
Yeah.
Here we are letting one company take over an entire set of orbits and parking 42,000 satellites. So should that even be allowed for one company to do that? Think about it in real estate terms on Earth, for example. And space is a shared commons. Unfortunately, we don't have any laws to regulate space in a manner which is equitable. That's the problem. The other concern is that when these constellations have thousands of satellites and they're flying in low Earth orbit, their lifetime is about 2 to 2.5 years and they die. So currently, the laws are such that they are mandated to deorbit dead satellites 25 years after they die. Up to 25 years. They have up to 25 years, which is ridiculous. They should be deorbiting dead satellites within a month to 3 months of their dying, because we have such a huge debris problem.
Yeah.
So we need the international community to come together and craft and ratify far-sighted and enforceable laws. It's not easy, but that needs to be done. Otherwise, there will be unilateralism, there will be bullying, people will get away with whatever they want to do. And regarding the junk that's going to crash into the moon in early March, that's, I think, about 4 tons of metal, the booster from Falcon 9 that's gone astray, with an engine. So that's a lot of debris that's going to be landing on the moon. It's almost like saying the moon is going to debut as a landfill. And you're right, if it were any other country other than the United States, say China or India, Russia, there would be a hue and cry, and there would be all these newspaper articles, sensationalizing the crash. And here they're almost glorifying it as if it's, fantastic to go crash into the moon. So yeah, that's the whole narrative thing we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. And there were articles about, they were wondering whether Musk will face any kind of action at all, whether he'll be sued.
Yeah, there are those very interesting opinion pieces for those of you who are interested in knowing about space law and repercussions. But I doubt under the current laws, there will be any action against Musk. There could be action against SpaceX if that 4-ton chunk of metal was actually going to fall on one of our countries or islands or something. But out there, in terms of sovereignty, nobody can sue them. It's the moon. It's a common human heritage kind of thing. So I don't think there will be any repercussions.
Right. As someone who's passionate about your work as a climate activist, do you think the space community and the space agencies in general are able to find a balance between exploration and what can be done to further Earth as a habitable place continue instead of completely giving up on it?
I don't think we can give up on our home planet. I think if you look at our home planet, the biodiversity that we have, the kind of colors that natural illumination brings to us, the atmospheric blanket that we have. We have 2 different Van Allen radiation belts that protect us from galactic radiation, and all of us would be exposed and be suffering from cancer. I think our home planet, despite the climate collapse that's happening because of human activities, the way we have sort of trashed our home planet, we are suffering, environmentally speaking. Despite all of that, I think the Earth is far too precious for us to say we just give up on Earth and make Mars planet B. I mean, Mars is not going to be planet B for the 8 billion people who are on Earth. Maybe a handful of wealthy individuals can go to Mars, but that doesn't make it planet B.
Yeah.
So Earth, we still need to take care of our home planet. We need to change human behavior individually and collectively. We need to have millennials and Gen Zs kind of take charge of the planet, because clearly the preceding generations, for political reasons, for military reasons, for business reasons, have quite openly, overtly treated the home planet very poorly. So I don't think giving up on the home planet is possible, and it's also not advisable. I mean, it's such a wonderful blue planet that we have. Why would we give it up?
It is, yeah, the blue dot.
Absolutely. And I think even when anybody who's listening to the show, if you go into an extreme environment, go to the polar desert, or go to the dry desert, or go to wet tropical forest, and try to live in those environments for extended periods of time, you will realize that nature is quite amazing. You often hear people saying that, oh, our planet is very fragile. We need to take care of it. But the reality is we humans are fragile. We will perish. The planet will go on. Look at Chernobyl. After humans were evacuated, after the nuclear, the accident that happened in Chernobyl in the 80s, I think. Once humans went away from that town, the wildlife came back. It's thriving. Even in a radiation environment, the wildlife is thriving, the trees, the animals. So I think we humans need to be a little more humble and need to recalibrate our importance in the universal scheme of things. We really are, as Carl Sagan said, we just are a speck of dust.
Yeah.
I mean, we can perish. The planet will be fine. It will go on without us.
Right. Is that one of the things you're hoping to do through S2, work with the younger space entrepreneurs on how to tackle such issues?
I think Spaceport SARABHAI will definitely focus on space environmentalism. We will definitely have a role when it comes to dealing with the problem of space debris, which is acute at this point, through space policy and law. But when it comes to the Earth's climate, I engage with young people through other fora, through talks, through other ways. I write things in the media. So I think I do have a wish to sort of start a movement, maybe a couple of years down the line, because this year and next I will be focusing on building up the space think tank. We will, I'm thinking, bring together people, and I want to start a movement that I want to call We Are All Astronauts, to remind young people that we are actually living on a spaceship right this very moment, and we need to take care of it. And the fact that we are living on a spaceship that's hurtling through space, we are astronauts already. So I think we need a mindset shift with our young people in order to sort of build climate consciousness and planetary ethics.
That's actually a very interesting concept. That's what you're basing transgravity about, right?
Exactly. Yes. We should not draw a line between Earth and space because Earth is already in space, Yes, absolutely.
It's definitely a different perspective to look at, an interesting one. Yeah. In terms of women engineers and women representation, coming back to ISRO, it actually is not so bad compared to other space agencies in the world.
Oh, ISRO is one of the best.
Yeah.
ISRO is one of the best. ISRO has always had an amazing gender balance. Even today, I was on a panel with Dr. Lalit Ambika, who is heading the human spaceflight program for ISRO. And I believe ISRO has about 20% of its workforce is women. That's very high compared to most space agencies. When I started off, professionally speaking, working in the space world in 1998, I would say ISRO and NASA had the best gender ratios.
Okay.
The Europeans and the Japanese had to catch up. And now they have much better gender ratios 20 years hence. But still, I think ISRO and NASA still have one of the best gender ratios in the world. So ISRO, we have no dearth of women. We've had women heading entire satellite programs, women heading the rocket development program. What I want to see is a woman heading ISRO.
Yeah.
It's been 50 years for the agency. We have amazing women scientists who are heading such amazing programs. So why not have a woman chairperson for ISRO?
I agree. In fact, recently ISRO got a new chairman.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So let's hope in the next decade, hopefully there'll be a woman chairperson.
So I, for one, am definitely pushing for ISRO having a woman chairperson. So let's all push for it and it'll happen. We have amazing women working in ISRO and they can definitely lead the agency. There's no two ways about it.
As a woman engineer yourself, if I may ask a personal question, you've done so many adventurous things. You spent a night in a submarine, you've gone to the Arctic and Antarctica, and it was fascinating to read all the stuff that you've done. How did you escape the traditional societal pressures women had to face, especially in the 80s and 90s?
Yeah, I think two things. I think one is I grew up in a very gender neutral environment. My parents never set any kind of limits in terms of what I should do or what I can do or what I should be doing. So I had all the freedom that you can imagine, more freedom than most people have anywhere in the world, actually. So that was definitely a first. And the other thing is, I, as an individual, I've always been fearless about, I go out and do things without any fear of what the outcome might be or any anxiety about what the consequence might be, right? So when I started working for Boeing in Southern California in 1998, I was pretty much the only foreign national on a defense site. Foreign nationals don't work in aerospace companies abroad unless you're a citizen of that country. So to make that happen, it took 15 months. I can write a book about it, how I made that happen, right? Or if you look at trying to find $35,000 in 1996 to go to the Space University without having the internet at your disposal, how do you raise that kind of money in 8 months?
Yeah.
Well, I could, right? Or, leaving Boeing in the year 2000 and moving to San Francisco and then starting a small company called MoonFront. I remember when I was leaving Boeing, my boss said, Susmita, think twice before you leave the company and just try becoming an entrepreneur. It's very, very hard, because he had tried and he had come back. But I still went ahead and did what I wanted to do in a country where I was on a work visa. People don't do that. People, work in a company for many, many years, get their green cards, and then get a mortgage, the usual linear trajectory of living. So I never subscribed to any of these sort of traditional paths to what you do professionally and how you live a life. It takes, what it needs is a healthy appetite for risk taking.
Yeah.
I often tell young people it's okay to jump off a cliff and grow your wings along the way. You might crash land and hurt yourself. So what? Just pick yourself up and go build your wings all over again. I mean, I think a lot of parenting that is happening that I see now around me is, one is children these days, they have a lot given to them already. They don't have to take much risk. Many of us in the 70s, 80s, 90s, we really had to pay our bills once we graduated. We had to take loans to be studying and things like that. Things have changed. And I also think risk-taking has become trendy, Mahati, if you see, because of these VCs, venture capital firms. When I started my first company, VCs were not putting money into space companies. Now they are, finally. So I think even risk-taking is now becoming fashionable.
It is.
Because of the whole VC culture. I think it's very important that young people, some of them go out and work for companies and organizations, and some should go out and start their own ventures, because that's the only way you can sort of challenge the status quo or change the world, so to speak.
And definitely such an adventurous full life you've been leading.
Yeah, I've had a very, very happy ride, I don't even use the word career because I don't believe in it. I think it's been a wonderful ride, living in many different countries, working with many different space programs, getting to meet wonderful, wonderful people around the world. I mean, imagine if I had just stayed down with NASA or with Boeing all my life. That would have been such a closeted existence, right? I would have been bored to death. I could never do that. So,
do you have any regrets?
I've been asked this question before and I've thought about it, and I quite honestly have no regrets. I really have no regrets. I've had the most wonderful life I could have asked for. So no regrets.
That's great. On a last note, as someone like me, like I mentioned earlier, my kid who's interested in space, and he's just 8. How can more kids of that age to, look at space as a something to explore? How can we open up that for them?
So I think usually when kids are in school, one of the things which is sort of naturally comes along is astronomy, right? But I think what's important for parents is to talk to their children and tell them that space is quite vast. Okay, there are satellites that you need to design and build. There are rockets that you need to launch your spacecraft into orbit. There is something called orbital mechanics. It's the choreography of how you launch things into outer space and how you help them travel to other planets and other destinations. There is human space exploration, where humans engage in exploring planetary destinations or low Earth orbit. What kind of experiments can be done in orbit on the space station, for example? There is life sciences. You can be a flight surgeon, right? Because the physiology and psychology of space flight is very complex. There is also the world of satellite services. Whether you're using your ATM for drawing cash or watching television or using GPS on your phones, these are all made possible through space technology and space assets. So you could be someone who can design wonderful new applications using a cocktail of these different space satellites, for GPS, for remote sensing, for telecom. For example, Mittal bought OneWeb, which is again a constellation.
Okay.
A telecommunications constellation. So I think children need to be, first of all, exposed to the idea of these various facets to space exploration and utilization. And then they can make a choice as to what is it that interests them. Do they want to design a rocket engine? Or do they want to design a spacesuit? Or do they want to help the farmer in their village use satellite data to get a better harvest, right? So once they figure that out, I think it doesn't matter what engineering or what science you do as your undergrad. That's the foundation here. You learn to do what I call systems thinking and problem solving. And, I have 4 different degrees. I have an undergraduate degree in electrical engineering. I have a master's degree in industrial design, because I was very clear I wanted to design things for living in outer space. And then I have a second master's, not so much for another master's, but to be part of the international space community when I went to the Space University in Strasbourg. And then eventually I also got a PhD in aerospace architecture, where my dissertation looked at how can we improve the fidelity of planetary mission simulations on Earth. So what I'm trying to say is you can be multidisciplinary. Yeah, you can choose 2 different disciplines. You can choose one discipline, but it's all about slowly navigating your way depending on what is it that excites you, what is it that you're passionate about. But one of the things that I often find with young people these days is everybody wants to graduate and earn big money with a big tech company. So as a parent, steer them away from that. Not everybody needs to work for a Facebook or Google or Twitter. I really think just stretch their imagination, show that the world is a beautiful place and there are so many things they can do with it. I mean, they can become a space environmentalist, right? I mean, anything is possible.
Yeah, definitely. I think that avenue will open up in the next, decade or so.
So there you go.
Thank you so much, Dr. Susmita. It was such a wonderful conversation and an honor to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you have any queries or feedback, you can reach me at maharanitalks@gmail.com or at Maharani Talks on Instagram. Take care.